Hello, today on Breaking the Spell, we're very honored to have Kokila Annamalai with us. She is a co-founder of the Transformative Justice Collective, which is an organization that is working to reform the Singapore criminal punishment system. She has also worked with different organizations on the left. And a lot of people know her through her incredible and fiery Facebook posts, which I'm a fan of and enjoy. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So just to warm things up, I'd like to ask you if you can remember the first time in your life when you realized things weren't the way they should be.
So this is an interesting question. I think I can't pinpoint a particular instance or incident, but I think on reflecting, what I have arrived at is that growing up kind of neurodivergent, I have ADHD, and also finding myself to be drawn to non-conforming behaviors from a very young age. I think things about the way our world works stood out more acutely and painfully to me because I didn't fit in often. And I also had a caregiver as a child because my mother was a single mom, and so a relative from India who was much poorer than my family came to Singapore on a work permit to look after me and my sister. And I think the way that my family and wider community treated her was something that troubled me deeply as a child. And she was, the person I think I was most deeply bonded to. And so the kind of contrast between how I saw her and how everybody else saw her or treated her, I think left a deep impression and a lot of pain for me. And I think I saw a lot of that kind of marginalization and oppression of people around me repeat as I grew up, and also experienced it in many ways myself. And I think I think that has been a consistent and an enduring feeling about how the world we live in is made unnecessarily painful for many people. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any specific experiences you can share about how it was challenging for you as a neurodivergent person, and specific things that were it made it difficult to
Sure,
fit in? And
yeah. I mean, I was always getting into trouble at school, right? As I was beaten. Back in the day, you were still allowed to hit children in school, right? So I received a fair amount of physical punishment, as well as being made to sit outside of the class a lot of the times. I was often humiliated by teachers because I couldn't focus in the ways that were expected. I didn't know. I think because of the way that my mind works, it was difficult for me to understand when I was supposed to talk and not. And so I was often asking questions or processing things by talking. And a lot of my, the way that I was punished both at home and in school. So I was a very heavily punished child. And my mother also was extremely controlling and punitive towards me because of the ways in which I couldn't conform, right? Just talking a lot, asking a lot of questions, or not able to follow rules that were set for me in school or at home. So I think those were quite formative things for me. Yeah.
I want to ask you, so from there, right, your mom being someone that obviously didn't understand your condition, neurodivergent condition, right? Has things changed? Is she now more aware about the way you are as a person? And obviously, can you also talk about linking that, right, with what you do right now? Because this is very personal experience for you, as you say, the marginalization and the oppression. But what about your political awakening? When did that come about? How did that come about?
Right. So I think that there's two questions there.
Yeah.
I think that my mother is definitely a lot more understanding of me now as a person than I was when I was a child. But it's also easier when she's no longer responsible for me right now. And she, I guess, is able to see that I found my way in the world and my way to take care of myself. There's definitely not the same context growing up. And but also ADHD is very underdiagnosed in girls and in women. So it took a long time for me and then for the people around me to understand what was going on for me. Yeah. In terms of my political awakening, I think it happened in many small parts. The first, I think, powerful experience I had in terms of the work I want to do and that the kinds of communities and spaces I wanted to be part of was when I saw some work when I was studying in India for a few years, and then there was a community development NGO in this rural area that was next to the school that I was at. And I think seeing the work there and how the community organizers brought people together in very marginalized circumstances in villages that were really under-resourced and faced incredible amounts of stress factors and disenfranchisement were brought together to take collective action and build community power. And so when I was in college, I took a year off to go and work in that NGO. And I think that was an awakening in the sense of what is possible when we come together as people in a community. And then when I was in college, I was writing about, for the college magazine at NUS, about issues like the death penalty and migrant workers and things like that already. But I didn't have deep understanding of any of these issues. It just troubled me in a very instinctive way. And I think it was discovering the interviews of ex-political detainees. I think I've talked about this elsewhere, but it was that that I think was one of the sharpest and turning points for me too, in terms of my commitment to working in Singapore civil society in particular ways. So I think the fact that we were sold and told a particular story about our history and how we came to be who we are as a people left again a deep impression on me, right? And in discovering these truths about all the people who suffered greatly and paid lots of costs for this narrative to be told and sold to us. And so I think there was a deep sense of betrayal. I think a lot of activists in civil society would relate to this. And I've been struck by how often when I ask younger activists and older activists what their political awakening was, it was the political detentions of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and discovering and I think there's two sides to that, right? I think one is discovering the incredible cruelty of the establishment, of Lee Kuan Yew in particular, and of the PAP government. And then I think there is an immense grief and a sense of inspiration at the people that existed then, right? The Lim Chin Seongs, the Said Zaharis, that I think is as much a part of that political awakening, knowing that, we've been told that Singaporeans are politically apathetic, they just, care about material things and are, we are just a society of indifferent capitalists, capitalist-minded people, or people who are very comfortable with capitalism, even as workers, and that's the kind of narrative that's been sold, and that we don't have the kind of fiery spirit of a more, societies that have a stronger democratic spirit of fighting for our rights and asserting our voices as citizens and things like that. So seeing that we do, in fact, have a very vibrant legacy, and just that we've been deprived that connection and continuity and that social memory, right, has been erased, I think was very evocative for me, both in then insisting on remembering as an act of resistance, right, and in supporting others in remembering too. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into there. Yeah, I mean, you know, I concur with you. I mean, like in our show as well, in previous episodes, we did talk about how Lee Kuan Yew's legacy just needs to be reckoned with, and I think maybe now we're coming to that stage of like slowly beginning to open up conversations about that. I mean, obviously, when he was around, we couldn't have very open discussions about the political detainees and, you know, the real history of what happened on there. So my question to you is that, like, when you find, you know, like the way you talk about very emotionally about like how you pick up themes about betrayal and grief and all that, right? Like when you share these stories with, say, other Singaporeans who, you know, are not as politically aware. I mean, do you feel like they also get touched? Do their minds change when you share this more factual details about what happened back then?
Yeah, I think stories are very compelling, right? And I think if you come across the page left.sg, they tell a lot of stories about that period of our history and how vibrant our trade unions were, and like what leftist organizing looked like at the time. And I think it has moved a lot of people, and a lot more people today, I think, are talking about those histories and wanting to connect to that. And I think that we're always hungry for a more like meaningful story of who we are, right, and how we came to be. And that's always, I think, something that touches people, because I think, you know, one of the things that I struggle to articulate, but I think I will try anyway, is that in Singapore, I feel like there is a constant sense of nowness in the way we operate, right? It's almost as if everything just came to be. Does that make sense? Like there isn't a very strong shared sense of this is the path through which we came here, and this is, you know, like you see a place and then a recognition of what it used to be before is not necessarily there, because things are constantly lost and taken away from us, both in terms of memory and physical spaces that have actually could carry so much sentiment and history is just constantly removed and erased, and it's like everything just came to be now. You know, I don't think we go about our lives with a very embodied sense of history and of these like legacies of continuity. Does that, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I mean, was it William Gibson who said Singapore is Disneyland with a death penalty?
Yeah.
And it's that Disneyland aspect of it, like things taken out of that and when you go to Disneyland, there's no context. There's all these different cultures, but no history, no context. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is because in so many ways we've been forced to forget. And I think that both our material conditions and the kind of meta-narratives of the society encourage the kind of like Disneyland-y way of interacting. And I think we interact with, as a result, the people around us and the spaces around us in a consumptive way, because we're not allowed to form deeper relationships than that because of the structural conditions, right?
And I agree with you that stories are so important, which is why I think we always start our show with the same question about, you know, to guests like remembering something in their past that changed them, right? Because I think that story allows us to really like connect to each other. And so in your story, I picked up this strong theme of punishment. I mean, you experiencing heavy-handed punishment yourself, but then also feeling a lot of compassion towards the punishments of others that were very heavy-handed. And this links, you know, up very nicely with your current work with the Transformative Justice Collective, which is trying to reform the whole framework of punishment that we have. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. What is, you know, TJC, what does it do? And
okay. Okay, so Transformative Justice Collective, we're slightly over a year old now. And we came together, I think, because of a shared desire to do more sustained work around the many harms of our criminal punishment system, and so whether that's like institutions of the police, prisons, the courts, and how they perpetuate different forms of oppression. And I think we saw that it was timely because conversations were starting to shift in Singapore. You know, like 10 years ago, when we would like write about the death penalty or speak up for somebody on death row, activists would get like death threats and like so much harassment and intense pushback from the people. And more recently, we saw that shift. We saw that people were definitely more critical of things like the death penalty, and that we were quite surprised the first time we got supportive responses when we started writing about it, like maybe a year or two ago. And I think Parthy Liani's case and a few other important events that have happened made people more willing to question the criminal punishment system and its fairness, and who it really protects, right? And who it harms. I think those conversations opened up immensely because of Parthy's case, but also because of some other things like, you know, there was a spate of judgments around sexual harassment where there was a perception that college students were treated with more generosity than others, and things like that. So I think these conversations, when we notice them developing in directions that were willing to question the state of affairs, and also I think it undermined in important ways the credulity of these institutions, right? Which are, I think, for a long time there's been an acceptance of how these institutions, they know what they're doing, and in Singapore things are all above board and everything is very fair, and these narratives, again, like repeated by the state and then sold to us through all the media platforms that they completely control, meant that there was very little room for those counter narratives. And I think when we saw that space opening up, we felt it was important to mobilize that energy and organize that energy, right, into deeper conversations and imaginations of other possibilities. So TJC is an abolitionist group, and I think most people associate our work against the death penalty with us, but we also are a collective that believes in and is committed to the abolition of police and prisons, and that I think is a far more radical proposition to many people, and I think so. This sort of conversations that we are hoping to build in advance are also along the lines of considering the histories of these systems, right? How did they come to be? Whose interests do they really protect? If we pay attention and are honest in reckoning with these systems and how they affect our communities and our psyches and the way that we think about the world. And it is not just about these institutions. I think also we have a strong commitment to drawing the connections to how so much of carcerality or you know, logics of punishment, of prison, of imprisonment, and of control pervade so many other aspects of our lives, right? So there's, like, we cane people in prisons, we cane children at home. Those are connected. We cane children in schools too. Domestic workers are caned, beaten. I mean, there's such compellingly depressing links, right? And you know, psychiatric institutions are prison-like. In many ways, schools are prison-like. So I think drawing these connections to how both in our most intimate lives and in our most public lives, these kinds of harmful ways of viewing and treating each other are perpetuated, I think are the sorts of things we hope to draw attention to, and also at the same time, you know, build community capacities and understandings and skills for alternative ways of responding to harm and of understanding harm. Like where does harm actually originate from? What do we consider harm, and what are meaningful responses to harm, right? Because the criminal punishment system doesn't do anything meaningful about the most severe social harms, right? Like more people are deeply affected by wage theft or terrible work conditions or by pollution than by murder, right? Or than by sexual violence necessarily. So, and what are the main things that people are in prison for? And are these violent offenses, or are these things that have caused harm to people, or are they things that have harmed capital accumulation, wealth accumulation, right? I think those are the kinds of analysis that I am interested in, and I think that we as a collective are interested in drawing more attention to. And at the same time, I think it is also linked to a much broader desire for a gentler society, for a kinder society, and for one in which we do not surrender so much of our power to large institutions. I think that is the much more broad philosophical orientation, right? So it's not just police and prisons, but I think what it has done in many ways is it has incapacitated us in knowing how to be with each other, right? That if a neighbor is playing music too loudly, we call the cops instead of having a conversation with the neighbor. If somebody posts something online that we don't like, people call the cops instead of talking to that person. So it is impoverished, I think, our ability to turn to each other and know how to be with each other. And I think that, to me, is also a really profound kind of transformation that I have a deep desire for.
I'm thinking some people might wonder if it's really necessary to abolish prisons in order to do that. I mean, we could still try and work on, figuring out how to get along with our neighbors while keeping prisons. And so I'm like, do you think prisons, is it something that you think can be abolished overnight, or are there things we need to do along the way to get there? Like, what does it look like to you, this whole process of getting to the point where we don't have any more prisons?
No, that's a great question. And of course, I don't think that happens overnight. I think some abolitionists, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, has famously said that abolition is not the absence of prisons and police. That's not what it's about, right? It's about the presence of all the things we need to thrive, so that we don't need prisons and police and they become obsolete. So it is not just having alternative ways of responding to harm, but recognizing that many of the things that put people in prison come from circumstances of oppression and marginalization. And if we invested in communities, if communities had access to resources, to health care, to food security, to meaningful education, meaningful lives together in community, then a lot of the things that put people in prison wouldn't happen. And if workers had access to just working conditions, they would be able to negotiate better wages instead of having to participate, for example, in what is I guess determined to be illegal kinds of work, right? And then end up in prison. Like why are so many, like the people who are in the drug trade and who end up on death row, why are they there? If they had access to viable means of making a living, or if there was not access to work, if there was welfare, then I think we have to ask the question, would these people feel the need to participate in the drug trade? Because it is at the end of the day, it is work, right? It is just work that is deemed illegal within this particular context, but they are doing acts of labor to facilitate an industry that ultimately generates wealth and profit for other people. And in that sense, they are workers. They're just illegal workers in our context, right? And so what is the access they have to meaningful, decent work? And also, so I think it is, again, another quote from an abolitionist is, we put people in desperate circumstances and then we punish them when they act out of that desperation, right? So that putting them in those desperate circumstances is already a punishment and a cruelty. And then when people do things to survive within those circumstances, we punish them further. Yeah? So I think that is a truth that resonates deeply with me. And so I think, I don't think that people, I think the criminal punishment system encourages us to believe that people are good and evil, or good and bad, and that bad people need to be punished, or people who do bad things need to be punished. But I think that we are all just grappling with the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and some of us have access to ways to live our lives without falling afoul of the law, which in many cases exists to protect property and wealth, right? And some of us aren't able to, we just don't have access.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow, there's a lot to go through. Trying to pick up many points that you brought up. But first thing I want to say first is that even I, having been someone who studied criminology, even I'm not too certain about where I stand on the abolition of prisons, because actually for one thing, I like to see fossil fuel executives go to prison one day. But kidding aside, I mean, I do of course think that one good way we should talk about this is, if not prisons, then what, right? And like for example, one of the things that I learned when I was in Australia is that you can have a very different approach to criminal justice, which is in the literature is called restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
So one example I can think of. I mean, I'm not I don't have all the details in my head, but for example, if a certain criminal act has been committed, usually what happens is that they get the perpetrator and the victim to get together in a room, and they talk it out. They form ways to how they should reinstitute.
Yeah.
To compensate, right?
Mm-hmm.
The victims. Cause of grief and damage, right? So in that sense, you don't really need to put people into prison. But another way of also talking about it is that there are many prison systems in the world where it's definitely not so punitive and not so horrible. So you've got prison systems in Norway, right, if I'm not wrong, where it's very humane, and people actually go there where there is a real chance for them to be reintegrated back to society. So why not you also try to explain what your vision is,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of viable system you think we can have? And look, I mean, I do think it's a very hard sell for many people who are going to hear this. They're going to be like wondering, what if, the guy that killed, his wife or something like that, are you telling me this guy's not going to go to prison? So I think you need to address very hard questions about, maybe very horrible crimes, right? At the same time, we have another separate set of questions about, regarding the marginalized, right? They commit crimes out of desperation. Shouldn't they be entitled to a fairer, sense of justice, right? And maybe for them, they don't deserve to have, prison at all. So so
right.
maybe give us some sense of like what you're thinking of.
Yeah, I think these are all very great questions. So I think we will all land at different points on this question, and it is definitely a very uncomfortable and provocative, I think, stance to take abolition, and I don't take it lightly, right? And I think that there are again many of my peers who might share similar views, but who would say, we shouldn't go around saying that because people won't get it, and we have to be strategic, and we have to slowly work towards those things. And I think for me it is very intentional in naming these things because I think that there is a power in that honesty, that this is what I stand for, and then to start the conversation from there and not try to
sugarcoat it or anything.
Or quietly try to push people in that direction, right? And that I want to surface that discomfort and then have a conversation about it. Okay, so in my mind there are just to simplify it, and of course this is reductionist to some extent, but I think you can think broadly of three categories of circumstances that we're generally talking about, and sometimes we talk about them in
we overlap them.
And then it gets confusing. Okay, so I think that so there's circumstances in which I think restorative justice is a really powerful alternative, and TJC also does restorative justice facilitation. So we have supported people in circumstances of interpersonal violence or in harassment or different kinds of abuse at the workplace to come together to repair relationships and to address the harm that has happened. And so I think that is usually most powerful or effective when people have shared community, right? Or where they can be brought together in shared community. So for example, in a family environment or a shared workplace environment, so as long as they share some kind of community, even if it's an online community or a school community, that creates the context for restoration, because there are shared commitments and people who can support them in that journey. And people who can support them in accountability that they're choosing to enter into. And so that is work that we're committed to doing and creating more resources and capacity for, right? So we're also working I mean, I also work in a neighborhood, and I won't say which one, but in a particular neighborhood to build that local neighborhood's capacity in responding to sexual violence when it happens in their community, right? So, and that actually involves a lot of things that is not just responsive, but preventative, right? So when thinking about actually what are the kinds of cultures in which sexual violence happens less, I think that's not something that, something like the criminal punishment system is ever set up to even imagine or resource, right? So, and these are things that only communities can do for themselves. And so what we arrived at is that if a community is to be free of child sexual abuse, or to very significantly reduce child sexual abuse, it needs to be a community that is child affirming, right? That a community that signals respect for children, not just one where you're looking out for the bad guys or like keeping your children at home. And that's not what's prevention, but we recognize, I think it's very clear in a lot of historical, like if we study history and if we also look at the research and the evidence on it, that people who face violence disproportionately are people who have lower standing in our societies, right? Who are vulnerable, like women and children, for example. Domestic workers is a particular segment of vulnerable women. And so then the meaningful intervention there that is transformative rather than just plugging, or like sort of, creating appearances of dealing with a problem, is to transform that status, right, of vulnerability. So what does a child-affirming culture look like, where children are respected and their voices are heard, where they're not just encouraged to speak up when they face abuse, but to speak up in general, right? Where children are not, I mean, you can't beat children and then say you want to end child sexual abuse. You just cannot. It doesn't go together. So I think, and having those kinds of transformative conversations is what I think is meaningful as a way to address these kinds of harms. Because we've had criminal punishment systems around forever. I mean, okay, actually technically not forever, but for a long time. And yet sexual violence or domestic violence, interpersonal violence is only going up. So one of my questions is, if we want to put people in cages, which is, regardless of how fancy the cage is, it is civil and social death, right? It's either permanent, civil and social death, if you're in life imprisonment or on death row, or it's at least temporary civil and social death. If we want to do that to people, what is the evidence we have that this works? Like, shouldn't the threshold be so high? I mean, can anyone show that incarceration has reduced gender-based violence, has reduced child abuse? We only see the contrary, right? So I think what we are often we've internalized a lot of these narratives that we don't actually look at the evidence. We don't care to see whether this is effective. We just want something to be done, and it's about the appearance of something being done. And then, how can we feel appeased when somebody who violently abuses a child goes to prison, when there's so many other children facing that abuse? Why does that comfort us, is my question, that this person is behind bars? It should not comfort us, right? So I think that there is that category of actions for which restorative interventions make sense. And then I think that there is a category of things that are currently criminalized that can just be decriminalized without any alternative, right? So in one instance, currently criminalized actions can have restorative alternatives. In one instance, they can just be decriminalization, like all the ways in which our political and civil liberties are restrained, right? So should we just decriminalize peaceful protest? You decriminalize people assembling, we decriminalize people associating, not requiring them to have a permit or a license or registration. We decriminalize, all the ways in which we currently criminalize and censor free speech. So those things can, in my view, just be decriminalized. No need alternatives. Just let people have those freedoms, because these are all kinds of the criminalization and we see that, intensifying in really dangerous ways, like with POFMA and with FICA, and a whole host of laws, that contempt of court, sub judice, all these laws that the state has increasingly put into place to make basic freedoms criminal actions, right? So I think those category of things, okay, just decriminalize. And there's a third category of things which I think are actions that are currently criminalized that instead need care. So if somebody is, lots of people who are currently sent to prison are people who experience addiction. And so what they need is care, resources, somebody who's going to prison for stealing something, what they need clearly is welfare. So that's how I see it. I see it in these three categories. There's in one instance, the alternative is resources and care. In the other, it is community empowerment to respond in restorative ways. And in the other, it's just to get rid of these terrible laws.
I think we should leave this session with one good slogan: decriminalize basic freedoms. I think that's such a powerful slogan. We should actually just say that, like, this is it's a bit like how you're talking about how difficult it is to get people to understand these ideas, because like in America, right, they have this thing called Abolish, defund the police, right? And it's catching a lot of controversy at the same time as well, because people are trying to understand, okay, if you defund the police, what happens, right? So I think at the same time, as you're talking about, I mean, I like the way that you have this different, this framework, right? Like there are three different things we can do. It doesn't mean that you lose, it doesn't mean you let crime run rampant. That's not what you're suggesting at all. You're just saying that we have a much more evidence-based actually approach, right, to understanding, you know, okay, if you put people into prison, but it's not actually affecting recidivism rate, then what are we doing it for, right? So
and I think in the community response area, there's actually an incredible number of possibilities, right? It's not just a restorative facilitation process, which is usually something that happens after the fact. Like, you know, you punched Douglas, and then like a week later, a few of us come together in a circle and we're like, okay, what can you do to put this right? How does Douglas feel? You know, Douglas can read you an impact statement, and you have to process how this affected Douglas, and we have this whole conversation. That's one possibility. But I think also there's so many skills that we can learn that would de-escalate a lot of things before they happen. So if more people learned bystander intervention, for example, like when you see something happening, we are all encouraged in our society to like walk away from it, right? And so what happens instead if we step in? And if we feel equipped and have the skills to do that, to de-escalate the situation, if we had more people trained as first responders rather than as police officers who could step into a situation and de-escalate it and provide safety for the people involved. If we had more community centers where people could go if they were feeling unsafe, right? If women did not feel safe at home because of a violent, abusive relationship and needed somewhere to go, then those are the things that could really de-escalate and prevent things from getting to a point where somebody's harmed so severely too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel there's a parallel to what we actually see in the healthcare sector, where there's so much less effort put into prevention and, you know, more into, just the medicine or the surgeries that, you know, fix a problem once it's gotten big. And so I wonder if all of it is actually connected to the kind of very short-term thinking that we all have in our societies, where we're not willing to make these investments over the long run. I mean, because a lot of things you're saying actually sound like very common sense, and, you know, like who would be against resourcing communities and empowering them to settle their own problems? So I'm wondering, like, what, you know, why then is there so much resistance to that? Where does that resistance come from?
Let me add on to that question, right? Because I would assume that you've had interactions with state agencies, right? And, you know, one of the things that you know, we were going to talk about is that, okay, you know, there is a ministry that's literally called the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, right? And even taking into account, you know, the criminal justice system, I mean, I'll read out the quote later if we need to, but the idea is that they also try to put out statements saying that we're looking into community-based interventions and stuff like that. So what I want to ask you is, right, is, as what Ong-Soo was alluding to, it sounds very common sense. It sounds like this is the way we should move forward, but, you know, this is obviously not the way the state is doing it. So why, you know, why is that the case, you know? Yeah. You got a good idea? You got a good answer for us? Well, I mean, basically what kind of, you know,
I have a theory. So my theory, or at least my analysis, is that when communities have power, it threatens the state and it threatens capitalists. And so when you say who would not want to resource communities, I think it is an authoritarian capitalist state and capitalists who would not want to empower communities, because the state maintains power and control by but through our belief that we need them, and through this bargain with the state, right? That they need to provide these sorts of institutions like the police and prison and healthcare and build roads, do all of these things, and in exchange we will trade our freedoms. And especially in the Singaporean context, I think that's the political bargain, right? We trade our civil and political liberties in exchange for these kinds of institutions. And I think what we experience very acutely in Singapore, and to a great degree in many other heavily institutionalized societies, is where large institutions, and often state institutions or corporations, either ones, have colonized our lives so completely that we are thoroughly disempowered in meeting any of our basic needs in community and with ourselves, right? And these are all capacities that we used to have in community life. Right? The ability to care for each other when we're sick, the ability to mediate and put things right when something goes wrong, the ability to care for our children and for our older people. And all of these things, all of these capacities are I think, ripped from communities through a capitalist system that turns us into workers that help like a small group of people accumulate wealth and power, and in that way disempowers us from continuing to develop the many skills and capacities that people in community have always had and been able to offer to each other. And then we're I think focusing on selling so much of our time and labor to the workforce, to capitalists, so as to be able to survive, means that we're not able to meet so many of these needs in community. And then the state comes in through all these institutions to say, this is why you depend on us, right? So when we are in distress, we call the police, or we go to a social service agency run by the state, and not to our neighbors and to our community. And I think that there is a very strong political stake in ensuring that our lives remain colonized by these institutions, right? Because we can be controlled so long as we have this incredible dependence on these institutions. And once we are able to experience the freedom of community, I think we will be much less willing to keep up these bargains. And that is what people in power are most afraid of. And so, to the question on MCCY, I just think MCCY should be abolished. Because it is so, to me, there is nothing more antithetical than the state doing community development. What does that even mean? So when I say MCCY should be abolished, I don't mean that lightly. I mean that the state needs to withdraw, and that is actually the biggest gift to us as people, is having our resources and community spaces and efforts to be ours and not the state's, because the state will only work in its own interest, in furthering its own power and control. Whereas, if MCCY was interested in empowering communities, they should let us have access to our community centers. They should be ours. Our void decks should be ours. They should not be void. We should have the right to associate in community, to occupy space, come together, have community meetings. We can't even do those things in Singapore, right? So what is considered the grassroots is completely colonized by the state here. And the other thing MCCY could do, if they were interested in actually empowering community, is persuade MOM to give people much better labor protections. Because if we are working, if we're not so overworked, then we have more time for community, right? So actually the things that we need to build community are time and space. Those are the two things the state and capitalists take from us. So they don't need to facilitate community development or hold these meetings. They just need to withdraw. I mean, what did we see happen during the pandemic where more people were at home? Community grew. In many neighborhoods, community grew because people had more time with each other. It is the most natural thing for people to build community. There are just many obstacles and barriers created by the state currently in our way. If they retreat, we will build community. MCCY does not need to build any community.
Yeah, I want to tie this to a term that you've brought up a couple of times, marginalized communities. And I was wondering, what is your definition of marginalization? Because it sounds as if, we, in this scenario where the state has colonized so many people's time and space, that in some ways we could all be marginalized to some extent.
Absolutely.
And, so what are the little nuances there, and because I think a big theme in your work is that you really fight for marginalized communities. And in my mind, I used to think, oh, marginalized communities are the minorities or the people on the fringes. But then as I hear you talk more and more, it's like, I feel like this domain of marginalization is actually quite massive, and a lot more people might actually fall into that category than they realize.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that my own understanding of marginalization has shifted so much in the last many years of doing this work, right? Is that I used to also think of marginalized communities as the most disenfranchised communities in our society. And I do think that there is a value in naming that experience because it is so distinct. And actually, what I find most valuable about naming that distinction is to see that when people have no access to many of the things that the system currently promises and offers, the innovation that happens on those margins, right? So I think it is actually most valuable, not in terms of noticing the deficits, but in noticing the incredible innovation and alternative solutions to life and the problems it offers on the margins, because there's in many ways these are communities that exist outside of what systems are able to offer, if that makes sense. And then I think there's a particular set of challenges and forms of oppression that people experience when they are still entangled in many ways with the system. Like if we were to take an example, like in school, right? I think that there is a particular kind of pain and exclusion and marginalization that students in who are discriminated against or who are under-resourced and considered to be like less competent learners face, like students in say NT tracks or EM3 tracks face a certain circumstance. And then there's a different kind of pain for students who are then seen as being in many ways to conform to what the education system demands of them and to be quote unquote doing well in the system. There's a different set of pain and stressors in that environment. So I think it is then more helpful to think about the different ways in which all of us experience oppression within current structures and systems, rather than to only think of some minority communities as facing oppression. In fact, the large majority of us are oppressed in society in different ways, right? Yeah.
Another thing, I wanted to pick up on is, you talked about this idea of prison as literally putting someone in a cage. You might dress it up and whatever, but it is a cage. And that person is socially and politically, exiled or cut off. And, during the pandemic, I feel like in talking to a lot of people actually, even just having to do a 2-week stay-at-home quarantine or even in a hotel, people who had to, spend their quarantine in a hotel would really complain and would really talk about the suffering. And I was thinking, if you think that's suffering, I mean, think about all the people who are actually in prison cells. And so I'm wondering if during this period of the pandemic, you found that there has been a lot more empathy towards people who are in prison, because so much of the population has actually had at least, even if it's superficial, but at least a slight experience of that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if subliminally it's had an effect, but I actually find that people don't make that connection often because I think in Singapore, a lot of the dominant public discourse is quite contemptuous towards people in prison, right? I think that there is a very strong cognitive dissonance between their own needing to be restricted to a hotel or home and then these bad people in prison who deserve it, right? There's this very strong sense that we shouldn't baby people who've done horrible things, and then that's just thought of in a very sort of non-specific way. That then there is this also assumption and trust that if people are in prison, they have done these horrible things, and therefore they deserve what's coming to them, and that this is how our safety and order in society is maintained, and that it should, and that we should not spend money and resources on their care, right? So I think that is actually the stronger mindset that I encounter. But where I saw a lot more public discomfort and empathy developed for is the prison-like, in fact, prison conditions in which migrant workers were kept and continue to be kept in dormitories still today, right? I think that is something that many more people felt deeply for. Again, not because there was a sense of that being not just, right? Because they haven't done something wrong. While with prisoners, I think that is still a lot more of a challenging conversation to have, because I think the state and our media and our society is in many ways has been very effective at dehumanizing people in prison. So people don't even think of them as people with families and interests and likes and vulnerabilities. Like they're just this kind of abstract idea of prisoners who are dangerous to our society, right?
It's so funny you use the word dehumanizing. Just for the viewers to know, I just had a 2.5-hour interview with a philosophy professor about dehumanization, so please tune into that. So just a quick plug. I wanted to pick up on that, actually, the death penalty, because I do think, like what you alluded to earlier, it is actually quite heartening to see there is this huge, groundswell of support, right? And it's coming especially to save Nagen, right? And you have this so much support coming from civil society groups, and that includes disability rights activists, arts community, healthcare workers, social workers, right? And you even have a petition where you almost have almost 100,000 members of the public signing it. So I think this is a really, really good sign. Earlier this month, there's a group of activists who also handed in letters to President Halima, right, to plead clemency for his behalf. So, I think there's something very instructive about his case, and I was wondering whether you can share with us, what are some important, lessons here, right, that you can pick up from his case that really develops that empathy, the public empathy for him, and by extension that the death penalty, is not a legitimate use of punishment for drug mules or whatever you want to put it.
Yeah, I think that Nagen's case was sort of the expression, the public sort of outcry around his case was an expression of something that has been building momentum for the last couple of years. I think with Syed Suhail's case already we saw a lot more public investment in his freedom, or in his freedom from the death row at least, and I think it is because Syed is so articulate, and I think a lot of people were moved by the letter that he wrote from prison to his lawyer, M. Ravi, that we then published. And then we did an interview with his sister where she told his life story, and I think that spoke to a lot of people. And I think it started, for a lot of people, the pieces started falling into place because they again, have been encouraged to think of people on death row as these incorrigible criminals who are dangerous to society, and here they are seeing their very real humanity, right? And the many ways in which the systems we live within have failed them, and how Syed went in and out of RTC as a child, and was recovering from and unable to recover from the trauma of his mother's death because of the many material kinds of discrimination and suffering that he faced. And so I think those things were already building some momentum, and people starting to reconsider, who are these people on death row, and are they a threat to our well-being? And I think Nagen's case in many ways shatters that image of the dangerous, incorrigible criminal, because he was so young when he was incarcerated, because he has psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, because he comes from an extremely poor family. I think all of those things coming together, it challenges everything people have internalized or learned to believe about dangerous drug traffickers, right? So I think that it was rousing for those reasons. And I think that is also why it is really important to use the platforms we have to amplify the voices of people on death row and in prison, because we talk about people who don't have a voice in society. People in prison are the ones with the least voice. Like, journalists are not allowed access to people in prison in Singapore. The only people, even friends are not, right? The only people who are allowed to see people in prison are blood relatives and family members. And that too if the prison approves that. So it's actually been really hard over the years to get their perspectives heard. And also a lot of family members of people on death row experience extreme stigma and shame, and have themselves internalized these narratives that their family is broken, that that whatever their loved one has done is not something that people can feel for, and so that there's a lot of silence. So I think breaking that silence was the most important thing, and having more family members speak up. And in Nagen's case, we had 232 family members of other death row inmates sign a letter. So I think those invitations, like over time, when one person speaks up, like when Saeed's sister Mila spoke up, in fact, there were a lot of other family members of people on death row who told her, why are you doing this, right? Why are you bringing your family this kind of negative attention? And so but I think, her conversations with them to explain why this matters and why she does not feel that she should be ashamed and should, fight as hard as she can for her brother's life, then I think was an invitation for others also to speak up. So I think definitely hearing directly from people who experience these realities forces people to confront their humanity.
Yeah, so I think this speaks to what we're talking about in terms of the power of stories, right? Like we need to have more stories like that. And as you said, the way that the media system is set up in Singapore is that this kind of marginalized voices just don't come, into public attention. And that is really a shame. The other thing that I just wanted to kind of collaborate your story with is a story of my own as well, because I also never had any real experience with someone who has taken drugs. And I have a friend who I only gotten to know like some years back, who has come across, who has encountered the criminal justice system, had to go to jail for it. And it was through that process, right, that I could see that that humanizing aspect of a person who uses drugs. And I think that is the problem in Singapore, which is the attitudes around people who take drugs, right, is really, really negative, really stigmatizing, when they don't realize that a lot of ordinary people do take drugs. And yeah, even this friend of mine, has actually eventually become a outspoken advocate, sharing her experiences and all that in prison. So I think that is the obstacle that we face. Yeah, because I think in terms of trying to abolish the death penalty, unless Singaporean attitudes are significantly shift around the attitudes to drug use, basically, I think it's really hard. Yeah.
I think it's also hard because it's a sort of catch-22 situation, right? Because when we at TJC build relationships with people who've been to prison, or the family members of people on death row, and of people who are currently incarcerated, and encourage them to speak up or tell their stories, then there's often a lot of fear of censure, of state backlash, and most importantly of societal backlash, right? Because there is so much stigma. But then the way to dispel stigma is often to speak up. So I think what really helps is them seeing and hearing more and more people being open and being supportive publicly. Because when we're able to show like, hey, look, this person did this interview and so many people were supportive and understood and it's made a difference, then other people are like, okay, maybe I can also tell my story, and not just my story, but my perspective, right? My analysis of what is going on. And I think we need to then signal, we have a responsibility to signal to people who are in the shadows because of their fear of what other people in their society and communities are going to say about them, that we will be inviting, and that if people are then hurtful in their responses to them or bully them, that we will stand up for them, right? And that we will step in. I think those are important things to signal so that people feel like the burden isn't on them alone, right? To dispel myths or to speak up, but that we will rally around them.
You mentioned earlier that one thing that's changed from, let's say, 10 years ago is that campaigning for abolishing the death penalty used to get you used to get a lot of hate mail, and now not so much. But do you still get like really negative reactions, and how do you cope with that?
So actually, I would I mean, all those years ago, I was not so actively and consistently campaigning on the death penalty. So, so people like Kirsten have been doing anti-death penalty work for much longer and in a much more consistent way. And often I would read her posts and then write my own, or like try to amplify some of those things. And then I've received some really harsh comments for sure. But I think now, somehow that is not, it doesn't feature so much.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, maybe Singaporeans are changing. So I want to now switch to another topic that we have, right, which is talking about domestic worker abuse, right? And I think it ties in with a lot of things that we're talking about how, whenever there is the media reporting on a case of domestic worker abuse, I mean, there's always very strong voices. It even comes from the government, it comes from people. There should be very harsh penalties, and we need to have these harsh penalties in order to deter future acts, right? But TJC obviously comes in with a very different perspective on this, and that harsh penalties are not really the only consideration, and we need to overhaul the system. So, I mean, what's the approach that you're recommending here? And I'm also wondering, how can we address not just so much domestic worker abuse, right, but the welfare of domestic workers itself?
Yeah. So again, I think it connects to what we were talking about. I think if you start the conversation from the perspective of what are the things that de-escalate these situations, right? So if domestic workers had their protected days off, and recently there's been a lot of debate about whether that 24 hours is too restrictive on employers, and it's just so, it's so disappointing. Yes, and so if they had protected time where they could go out and seek help when things are starting to get bad, then things don't have to escalate so much. Or if they had access to support services in their languages, in places that were embedded in their communities, right? Because some of them, not everybody can access HOME or TWC2, and these are, again, very small, underfunded organizations. So if we could invest in community-based, again, if we had actual community centers in our neighborhoods that were ours to imagine and run and create programs and projects and things that we wanted to. I think this could be one of the things, right? How do we create support services so people can just walk in and be like, hey, I need help, and it's so much more accessible. And if they had, the right to a phone that was protected, if they had the right to transfer, then they could choose to leave an abusive employer instead of staying with one till things got that bad. These things too, but also in terms of the broader structures and systems, right? That where a lot of people, a lot of workers in Singapore live in a kind of pressure cooker system, and I think this is what we don't talk about enough is the incredible stressors of living with somebody that works for you, and conversely whom you work for, 24 hours a day, and if you live in a large house with different sections, maybe that's less stressful. But for many ordinary people, it creates a very stressful and uncomfortable environment to begin with. So for domestic workers to have live-out options, I think is essential as something that would, minimize their vulnerability to a lot of abuse, so that it's clear. Because I think once they have live-out options, it's clear that they are workers. Because currently, also, the way that the system is set up is that many employers are encouraged to feel that domestic workers are their property, right? Whether it's the security bond system or the levy system, and the fact that they are responsible for things like this person's accommodation, healthcare, and all of those things makes them, but they're not a family member, means that they're often treated as property. And this kind of fear that if a domestic worker runs away, you're going to lose your security bond, and all the narratives, and even how domestic workers are often sold by agents, right? And like kept on display in agencies. Like all of these things reinforce this relationship to domestic workers as property, as subhuman, as people with not the same right to dignity and a full life. Right, and so I think I think it also manifests in the very specific kinds of abuse that sometimes you see domestic workers subject to, that they're treated in subhuman ways. So yeah, I think that first of all, a system in which I mean, I don't think that it is at all healthy to normalize live-in domestic work as a way of life. And why are we even in that circumstances? Because we don't have enough time and resources as workers to care for the people who are dependent on us and to care for our homes, right? If people don't have the time to do the cooking and cleaning and looking after children and looking after elderly, then we normalize that somebody else will do all of this labor, so that women too, in Singapore, like Singaporean women or women of higher socioeconomic statuses, can go out and contribute to, again, someone else's wealth accumulation is the sort of capitalist logic within which this transpires, right? But there is something deeply broken about that, I mean, in my view.
No, I actually like what you said, because I think I also feel like the main issue with this prevalent use that we have of domestic workers, actually, it just really goes back to how Singaporeans are overworked. They don't have enough time to go back home to do their chores, to have time for their communities and their families. And that's why they feel compelled to have to use domestic workers, right? If they live in a different country, and I have actually a personal anecdote on this, because I have someone who's planning to move to Australia, and that person found out, this person uses a domestic worker, and he found out that, to use a domestic worker in Australia, it will cost him 90,000 a year. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money, but the idea here is that, like, he still feels compelled to use it because he feels that, given that he works very hard, or there's a lot of children to take care of, he wants to relieve the household duties on his wife. This is the reason why he wants to do it. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have those structural pressures in place, then you don't have to feel compelled that you need to use one, because most people in the world don't use one in the first place. Yeah. But that's the problem, right? Singaporeans themselves are not keen to fight for better labor protections. And so I actually think it's good for us to talk about this whole idea that you've been mentioning a few times now, wage theft. Mm-hmm. I mean, to a lot of people, they don't understand what that means. So maybe you better break it down so they can understand what that means, and then they can understand that, okay, if I had better wages, if I had better labor conditions, then I don't have to feel like, I need to use a domestic worker. I don't have to, be in this, capitalistic, condition. Mm.
So, there are, I think, wage theft is experienced by many local workers too, but it's probably the most stark in migrant workers' realities. So maybe we could take that example. Yeah. But when a migrant worker has pay withheld for months, sometimes years, it can take them up to 4 years to have that salary dispute settled. And the settling of the salary dispute often looks like, in the best case scenarios, 50% of the wages owed being paid to them. That is the best case scenario after a 4-year battle with the system. And a domestic worker who steals $20 from her employer can go to jail for 2 years. Like, so this, again, that's what the criminal punishment system does. It does not protect us from wage theft. I mean, which is a greater harm? Somebody who is dependent on these wages to survive, being deprived of it for months and years, who has loan sharks back home harassing their family members because of all the agent fees they have to pay to come here that they're now not able to settle because of this wage theft. So I think the amount of harm is so far beyond our comprehension, and yet there is often nothing people can really do about it. And this is true for local workers too, right? It's so difficult to compel an employer to do what they are even meant to do within the law, let alone the fact that the Employment Act is extremely weak. And so the Foreign Manpower Act is even weaker, but even our Employment Act offers such few protections to workers, and even to get employers to comply with those conditions can take people years. They have to go to the magistrate's court, they have to get do so much paperwork, go through so many processes, and in the end, there's still no way to compel the employer. They can be given directions by the court, but it's very, very difficult to get them to comply. So I think that it's incredible to me that we have, as a society that is so invested in punishment and also thinks that we do a very good job of accountability of regular people, it does not actually invest at all in holding people in any position of power accountable, and where accountability matters most, right? And not with ordinary people.
So this is why it's good that you brought this up. I mean, that you made the connection so that people can see that they have more in solidarity with, a migrant worker, a domestic worker, than the CEO.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, because who's exactly the one stealing the wages, right?
Yeah. And we often, I think, it is unfortunate that we talk in terms of like migrant workers' issues only here, because it is fundamentally a labor issue, right? And that affects many of us, most of us, in so many ways that are deeply connected to migrant workers' conditions. And if migrant workers were treated better, were entitled to a living wage, that would raise everybody's wages too, because then you don't have a class of workers who can be who can be exploited to such an extreme degree that it then depresses everybody else's wages too, right? So all our plights are so deeply interconnected, and it isn't, again, in the interest of capital and in the interest of powerful actors like the state to keep us pitted against each other so that we are distracted by, whether that Chinese worker is getting slightly better privileges than me as an Indian worker, but actually we are both being oppressed by this employer, right? And by this business. So how do we kind of push back on those narratives that are so divisive, and the ways in which race and gender and different classes of workers are in these kinds of narratives are used to separate us and convince us that actually, that's the person who's after my lunch, and that's the person that I need to keep down so that I can stay 1 foot above, when actually I'm also drowning. Right?
Yeah, it's these are such deep-rooted problems, because I actually think it goes to the core of what capitalism is. Capitalism is by its very nature an extractive and exploitative system. I mean, going back 500 years from when it began, with the enclosures in Europe, with the peasants being kicked off their lands, and then slavery, driving the growth of capitalism. And, it's like, in this conversation, we can start with any topic, whether it's migrant workers, the prison system, wage theft, and as you unpick the knots, I mean, it all kind of goes back to the same theme that we are all being marginalized by capitalism, and that very few of us are actually left unharmed by it. And I would even go so far as to try and argue that even capitalists in the long run will be hurt by it themselves, because I mean, if we go out a couple of generations, capitalism is going to destroy the very environment and ecologies that we depend on. So even those capitalists are not going to have a great life based on this system.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know whether this sounds. I mean, this might like make people roll their eyes or get angry. But I think on a more philosophical level, I would even contend that it is not even in the future, but that capitalists today too, despite all the wealth, suffer a cost, a spiritual cost, I think, to the way we live our lives, right? And to the positions that they hold in society. Because maybe it isn't a certain idealism that I have, but I think that we are all robbed, capitalists included, of these much gentler, abundant, thriving ways of living together in community.
Yeah. I think we should probably start wrapping up soon. Do you have any?
Well, okay, maybe let me just go straight into my final question, I guess. But we can take it from there. So you've talked a lot about imagining futures, possibilities, and within our conversation we use language like let's say community building, incorporating people at the margins. So what I'm wondering, right, is that when we talk like this, some people find this language very abstract, right? They just can't really envisage what this is supposed to look like concretely. you know, and my way of trying to explain to people is that sometimes what we are asking for isn't very different. So maybe, you know, if we are saying that we just want better labor conditions, it's really not that different from what we are experiencing, but just having it much more humane, a humane lifestyle, right, in a humane environment. But some things are very radical, like what you said just now, maybe abolishing prisons. So, you know, what I want to ask you is, can you depict for us what kind of Singapore future you're aspiring to?
Well, I don't know if it will continue to sound abstract or dreamy, but my hope or desire is for a future where we have time and space, physical space, and also head space and other kinds of space to organize ourselves within communities, and you know, and those communities include our communities as workers. So whether at the workplace, in neighborhoods, in schools, as students, to organize ourselves to take collective action, so that there can be more self-determination of the people, and we are not we're not in such a passive relationship with the conditions that determine our lives, where we're able to reconnect to our power as collectives, right? And to have what is ours, these resources, returned to us. For nobody to have the right to take away our freedom to associate with each other, to have knowledge and information about us returned to us. You know, but there's so much opaqueness of data in Singapore, and the state hoards everything that is ours. I think our time. I mean, the state and capitalism hoards our time, our land, our information, and our freedoms, right? So I think that, yeah, I think that to be free from oppression is possible, and that also that possibility can only be realized if we recognize our power, both as individuals and in community, right, and in the collective, to enact that power and that freedom in both our most intimate lives and in our public lives, right? And I think that for me, it is very connected to think about it in the microcosm, as in the most private and intimate of ways, as well as in the most public and structural and systemic of ways. Because I think that there is very little meaning in talking about an abstract, gentler world when we're not yet skilled in being gentle to each other as we do this work too. So yeah.
I think my final question to you would be around, I think like it's so important to be able to create space for complex conversations, because I think it would be hubris to think that any of us know the answers. And I think one of the ways Douglas and I are approaching the show is that we're not experts, but I don't think you need to be an expert to be asking these really important questions. And we need to bring more and more people into this kind of conversation. So I was wondering if you had any ideas on how we can actually create those spaces for complex conversations in Singapore.
Create spaces for complex conversations.
Everyone should start their own breaking the spell channel.
Or how you're personally going about it. I mean, and you can even tie it to your answer to Douglas's question, and you said like it's both finding your personal power and then collective power, right? And so maybe conversation is a way to bridge the personal to the collective.
I mean, I think conversation is one way. I think that, I think that there are many things that So maybe if I can reframe or maybe adjust the question, expand it a little bit, I would say what moves people to reconsider the stories we've been told, right? And that then is a way to start to have more honest or deeper conversations. And I think that there's many things that do that. I think that there's provocative experiences and evocative experiences that can do this for people, right? I think, sometimes it's about having a deep conversation with somebody and creating a context that's a welcoming space where you're encouraged to have an opinion, encouraged to connect to your own truths and lived experiences, as well as to listen deeply to others. But I think that it's also more than that. I think it is seeing artwork that makes you ask questions. I think it is witnessing disobedience to a draconian law that can do that. Because so many people who are outside of the civil society space, when they ask me things like, how does M. Ravi do what he does, despite all the setbacks, what does it take? Or why does Jalavan go through all of these things? And that means that it's affecting them. That is a conversation. When I stage a protest, I am having a conversation with my fellow people, right? So conversations look like a lot of things, I think. They look like creating art, they look like writing, they look like talking, they look like standing in the middle of a street with a smiley face. Those are all conversations, and I think that anything that invites us to break free of the shackles that we've been told, we have to limit ourselves within and to live bounded by is a conversation.
I like that. That's great. No, I love how you broadened the notion of conversation. I really appreciate that, and I also like how you, you've now sort of allowed us to focus on a lot of the positive aspects of what we want, rather than just the negative things that we're fighting against. And I think that's really important.
I think that also in making change in Singapore, in years to come, right? I think your name will come up in the history books. That you'll be one of the key influential figures in the people's movement in Singapore. So maybe you can look forward to that kind of future as well.
Okay, I think it is. What is, I think, the most powerful possibility is where in history it is that the people rose up and not any particular persons whose names go down, right? But that the people go down in history as having fought for their freedom. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you. I think we all need to question this need for heroes or protagonists,
Yeah.
So, but anyway, we really do appreciate you coming here to talk to us.
It was great.
It's been incredible.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.